Hey, I'm Doc Frank. Welcome to my podcast where every week I'm presenting you authentic, spontaneous and unrehearsed discussions with interesting guests from the rail industry about topics that matter. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends about it, as this podcast will both educate and entertain them. Thank you for listening. Hi, it's Doc Frank here. Real quick, I want to let you know about one of the best CBTC trainings in the world, if not the very best, but you always need to be careful with superlatives. It's the CBTC Kickstarter online course. It consists of 30 video lessons. That's the 3 with the 0. In total, over 11 hours of training content, talking about everything from the basics of CBTC, current standards, the benefits of CBTC, the key functionality of it, the supply industry, application tips and tricks, lessons learned, do's and don'ts, case studies, arguably the most comprehensive training that you can find anywhere on the topic of CBTC. There are a few additional things that make learning easier for you that you may not find on any other online courses. One of them being an immersion plan that helps guiding you through the training course and progress it in a finite period of time instead of just having it sit there for months and months on end. There is access to an online study group where you can connect with other students who are doing that training course at the time and form learning groups. And after the training, you will not be on your own. There is an alumni community that allows you to ask questions about the course content on an ongoing basis. So it's basically education for life. You can register on my training portal, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023.
Episode 1 had a strong focus on CBTC interoperability, since this was the topic of Matthew Tan's final thesis and a couple of articles by Doc Frank in the IRSE News magazine. In this clip, Matthew and Doc Frank discuss the discourse about the need for CBTC interoperability in the railway industry, and likely reasons for that discourse.
For me, then, some of the considerations was actually, other than this just being a pure academic pursuit, is there really such demand? I mean, I spoke to some of the people in industries, because we get lecturers as well from the industry. Yes. To lecture as part of the course, which is, I really enjoy a lot, because you get to hear of the views of people who are actually out there in the field, and then they bring the experience in. So it's not just an academic pursuit, which I really enjoy a lot. But anyways, I reached out to one or two of them, and one thing led to another. So, one group of people, there's different schools of thought, obviously. So one group thinks that there isn't much demand because a lot of lines today, metro lines, are constructed in a way that fleets are captive. So one line just runs on its own. There's no need to interoperate in the first place from a civil perspective, so they're all constrained anyway. So is there really a demand for interoperability? Probably not. Then I've talked to some other people here and there. There's so many varying views, and subsequently I then chanced upon the IEEE 1474 study group, and that was sort of a confirmation that there is interest in this topic actually, and and boy, are there so many differing views on interoperability. How to get around it, how to solve the problem. The many differing views on just this one topic alone. I've been known, in engineering in general, I think, the personalities of engineers are rather, one where we try and solve problems together, right? And, usually we will settle on the solution quite quickly, but never have I seen in CBT, in the field of CBTC interoperability where there are quite strong views on how some things should be done in some way, or, does it make sense to even pursue it in the first place? So the views are really, there is discourse, and it's very interesting discourse. And never have I seen, the community getting together to say, look, why we should have it, why we shouldn't have it. I think this is good, that we talk about things, we discuss things together, and then figure out how, as a group, why we shouldn't pursue some things.
Yeah.
So again, this is just me stepping in as a start. So let's see where this journey goes.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is just my personal experience at the moment. So.
The tricky bit is that there are agendas involved in that discussion. And that leads to a situation where the outcome of the discussion is not always what you would expect to be as common sense or something like that, because people have different agendas and therefore they lead the discussion in a certain way. And a certain way could mean that they reject the entire notion of CBTC interoperability simply because they don't want to live with the consequences, what it would mean to make their products interoperable. Yeah, you see all the signaling suppliers have invested lots of money into the development and maintenance and continuous improvement of CBTC technology. That's a technology that exists since the mid-1980s. So over the last nearly 40 years, suppliers have continuously invested in research and development, upgrading hardware, fighting against obsolescence, improving the software, introducing new features, making the system more available, more redundant, higher performance for higher capacity, all these kinds of things. So there are commercial agendas, and suppliers are not particularly keen to spend a lot of money in redeveloping their products, especially if there are competing suppliers who don't have to spend that much money. So if you and I have two different CBTC products and the interoperable solution looks very much like your product, that means you don't have to spend anything or hardly anything on redeveloping, but I have significant investment to make my system look like yours, which is the interoperable solution. So that would be a competitive disadvantage that I have as a supplier compared to you as my competitor. And that means that I will do everything in my mind to prevent this from being the solution. Quite the contrary, I would like to have a solution which looks like my product. So that means that I don't have to invest anything, but you have the additional cost, and that's a competitive advantage for me. And this is the thinking which is humanly understandable and commercially understandable. That's the thinking of most of the suppliers, and I believe this is why things are the way they are. From a market perspective, from a client demand perspective, I see two different reasons why interoperability may make sense. One is when you really have an interaction between different railway lines, they merge, and you've got trains coming from both lines, and then you have a joint piece of trunk line, if you wish. And this trunk line needs to be able to operate both kinds of trains. So you do need some kind of interoperability for that. And a dual fitment is also some kind of an interoperability solution, if you think about it. And the other application has really a commercial background from a procurement standpoint. There are some horror stories out there about CBTC projects in some parts of the world where the original project, say, was a line with 12 stations or something like that, and it cost a certain amount of money. And then a few years later, there was an extension of the line, 2 additional stations, and the cost for this extension was about as much as the cost for the previous line, even though the initial line was 6 times as long as the extension. So what happened there was that the supplier used the leverage that they had by saying it's an extension. The client doesn't have a choice to go anywhere else for CBTC. They have to buy it from us. And therefore, we can basically up the prices as much as we like. And stories like this obviously scare off many new clients, railways that want to do CBTC, interoperability would give them a way out. So if the incumbent supplier was unreasonable for their price for the extension, an interoperable solution would enable the railway to go to a different supplier and say, well, you give me an offer for this extension, which may be cheaper. So there is still some kind of procurement leverage with the railway organization if you have an interoperable solution. Yeah. So I think these are the two main reasons. One is interaction between connected lines, and the other one is commercial procurement considerations.
A highlight of episode 2 was the Stephen Lemon's view that interoperability and resource shortage are two major challenges for projects in Australia, and the following discussion how a supply strategy can tackle both challenges, at least partially.
Well, I think some of the things we're seeing at the moment, and there's a lot of things I could talk about. One of which is this the makeup of Australia and this challenge of interoperability. I think it's a really important question. And it's a really difficult one to address in that, we've got a big country, we've got organisations, and we've got a rail network that operates federally. We've got multiple rail networks in states. We've got some trains that operate across all of that. We have a need for interoperability, but at the same time, the states are funded independently, are making decisions independently. They have an almost state-based obligation to get the best for their own taxpayers who are funding their own projects. And so convincing them to spend their taxpayers' money on things that benefit other parties is quite difficult to do in a business case. So I think this question of interoperability is challenging because the people who pay for it are not necessarily the people who see the benefits. So even if there is holistically a theoretical business case that says the benefits of interoperability outweigh the costs, if you've got one set of taxpayers paying the costs and another set of taxpayers getting the benefits, that's a difficult argument to make. So I think this is a real challenge for the industry, and so it becomes a challenge for individual projects because they're almost, for reasonable reasons, incentivised to ignore interoperability to some extent, and yet it's so damaging for the industry as a whole and the country for a whole when that happens. So I think that's one of the things, and probably the other one, and we can talk about that in a minute, and the other one I'll mention, you can then decide which one's more interesting, is just the resource issue as well. I think that some of the things we talk about, like CBTC being a great example, there's only a limited amount of experience in Australia. And so getting experts into the country that have the right experience and often you would see, and I wouldn't like to point the finger anywhere in particular, but I think there's a lot of people with good intentions doing good work most of the time working on these projects, but actually a lot of them don't have, just by the accidents of circumstance, just don't have the level of experience that is needed to understand some of the issues that can occur. Like how we get that experience distributed evenly as well across the country with the level of railway projects happening. You go out to market, this company wins this project, this other company wins this project, but then this first company wins a couple more projects, and this third company doesn't win any projects. And you've got expertise and experience relatively evenly distributed across them, but the projects aren't awarded in that way. And so when you've got constraints in the industry in kind of capability and experience, it's difficult to understand how we're going to make that work. You almost just need to have a more pragmatic approach to how we deal with that procurement issue, because otherwise you're just going to have resources constantly jumping between organisations, or some of your best experts sitting around with no work and other companies trying to deal with the problems without the right level of expertise, which can't, in a constrained market, can't be a good answer.
There are two aspects to it. I would see almost a separation between the supplier side and the and the client side. So for the supplier side, I believe, and in both cases, interestingly, in both cases, it's the client organization that can actively do something about it. So if we start with the suppliers, I see what's required is what I call a supply strategy. And Sydney Digital Systems is a really good example where this was really thought about right from the beginning. So you said for ETCS level 2 in Sydney, we think we need 2 wayside suppliers, not 1, 2. And in order to create an environment where you have 2 suppliers that are knowledgeable, that have a pool of experienced resources there that can build up experience for ETCS in Sydney, you needed to have 2 pilot projects, not just 1. And that was one approach as at that part of the project, what you could do in order to foster an environment with 2 suppliers. Because if you bring a supplier in just for some consultancy work, you help us writing a specification and then you can go home again, they wouldn't be motivated. That wouldn't work. But by having both of them doing a real project, they were motivated and they were sitting together with the client organization to write the specs. And now you have, at least for the time being, you've got a pool of 2 motivated ETCS suppliers that are doing work in Sydney. Looking in the future, it's up to the client organization again to maintain this pool of 2 suppliers by giving both of them work and not giving all the work to one and letting the other out to dry, because then they will close shop and go home, right? So that's something that the client can do for suppliers.
Sydney is just too big to have a single supplier across the whole network, and the risks associated with kind of technology obsolescence, with, you know, organizational mergers, with companies being awarded different projects and then not having the capacity to deal with other things, with us needing to do more projects in parallel than one organization. There was a myriad of reasons why we needed more than one supplier. I think in the long term, the whole network probably needs 3 suppliers, and that was our thinking originally, that but that we couldn't really start with 3 all at the same time. And that was this kind of balance between what do we need to achieve here in the long run and what will make the initial projects too complex. And that balance was, well, we can't, if we start with just one supplier, the first project won't be as complex, but the second and third project will be enormously more complex.
Yes.
If we can start with 2, the first one will be maybe a bit more complex than we'd like, but not too bad. And the next one will be a lot less complex, and the one after that even more so. And so that seemed like the right balance. And I think it was the right decision because, again, you can't always have that level of expertise in the client. And if a supplier tells you, look, I know the standards say this, and I know in the past projects have been done like this, but we think a better way of doing it is like this, it's not always that easy to know if that is a good idea or a bad idea. When you've got more than one supplier involved, you have got a sense check on it. And as you said, it's not just a sense check, it's a properly incentivized sense check where they know if it's the wrong answer, they've got to deliver against it at some point as well. So they've got real skin in the game. So I think then you get a better balance where they say, well, okay, this bit might make sense, but this other bit, that's just preference in their special technology. It's got no advantage to you as a client, and it's certainly got no advantage in terms of standardized approach or interoperability of other suppliers. And so that for me was absolutely one of the big fundamentals of the project, that the multi-supplier environment, whatever challenges it brings initially, in the long run, it will be hugely better for Sydney in terms of like the cost of future projects, and the competitive procurement market that will be retained because of it. It's a limited market anyway. Reducing that any further is just a recipe for excessive costs. So
the interesting thing is that you basically have a benchmark in Australia, not far away in Brisbane, where you can compare the 2 approaches in the near future, because Brisbane is currently doing ETCS level 2 for Cross River Rail and in inner city with a single supplier. And I believe it's a lot easier to go from 2 suppliers to 3 later on, as you plan to do in Sydney, rather than going from 1 supplier to 2. Because if you have 2 suppliers from the start for writing your specifications, what will happen is they keep each other honest. So if one supplier comes up with anything which is borderline not quite standard compliant, the other supplier will cry foul immediately, and then they sort themselves out. So the chances of ending up with a fully standard compliant specification is much higher if you have multiple suppliers in a room. And by multiple suppliers, I would agree with you that having 3 or 4 would have made it much too complicated. So going with 2 is probably the sweet spot where you can get the benefits of a joint specification without making things just too difficult.
Episode 3 had a special kind of highlight when the young signaling design engineer Ben Stockton literally geeked out about the fascinating field he works in. This clip goes for about 10 minutes, so if you find it going a bit over your head, make sure you skip without missing the following highlights.
I think one thing as a junior signaling engineer that I do respect is I have a tremendous respect for the safety critical nature of our work.
Yes.
And I personally will not consider, I personally believe it's not up to me to consider myself competent enough to do an independent design or to review. It will be up to James or any other senior signaling engineers that I happen to work with at that point.
Yes.
It's very, very important that one has an utmost respect, not only for the competency of one's superiors, in my opinion, but also the incredibly, safety critical function of our work. We have the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that railways are designed safely.
Yes.
And maintained of course, there's a huge amount of responsibility that goes towards, the principal maintenance technicians and the principals testers, without question. But we absolutely share in that safety critical environment. Protecting, conflicting, flanking, opposing collisions, and where possible derailments. If we have the ability to control the speed of the vehicle, or say if we're automating, if we're introducing higher grades of operational automation, then we take on more and more responsibility for the safe operation of the railway as time goes by. And personally, I think that it will take 10 years before I do become, at my current rate of development, before I do become or attain independent competency to be independent, mostly independent.
Yeah.
But that doesn't worry me. I feel that I've had and have an excellent cast of mentors and will have in the future to guide me along this journey. And then when I achieve that, it will then be my responsibility to pass on to the next generation.
Yeah.
Because we do have a special culture. We have a professional ethic that goes beyond anything I've ever experienced in my previous career. And, it motivates me. The functionality must be completely understood. And when I was doing my degree, I really gravitated towards model-based control. I gravitated towards systems in which the designer, the engineer, understands at a principle level what the system is doing. Because what you see is a lot of engineering systems are moving towards black box components with machine learning algorithms, where the internal functions of the machine, they're not just not known. In many cases, they're not able to be known. They're unintelligible, non-interpretable. So I always gravitated away from that and towards control systems where I understood what was going on from both a parameter perspective, an environment perspective, and the system dynamics perspective. And I love that in railway signaling because there's no room for error. There's no margin for error. If these systems have an unexpected occurrence, especially a SIL 4, a vital system has an unexpected occurrence, then it can cause, that's unacceptable. Unless it's an incredibly random, rare set of events. And that, I love that. Like all throughout my engineering education and career, I've been drawn to deterministic. That's the word, deterministic systems.
Mm.
And there's nothing really more deterministic, in my opinion, as an engineering field than railway signaling and railway signaling engineering.
Yeah.
I was going to add and telecoms, but telecoms is not deterministic. That's not so, and that's why it's not safety critical. I've never, since joining the signaling industry, I've been surrounded by people who think in broadly the same way. I mean, regardless of one's gender, one's ethnicity, there's a mindset and a common, way of seeing the world and engineering that kind of pervades. And I really enjoy being a part of this community. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It is a lot of fun. At a fundamental level, I do want to describe go into a bit more detail about how Tom Godfrey taught me about interlocking.
Mm.
And because we were talking about, a CBTC application of EBILOG 950,
Mm-hmm.
then what I had to learn was essentially how does the general application, how does one build, the specific application of an EBILOG 950 installation out of the general application of the EBILOG software. And what was really useful to find out is there's actually only 3 types of railway track at a very basic level in existence in the railways. And those are plain track, from a signaling perspective, not from a railway track construction perspective.
But
you have plain track, you have turnouts, and you have diamond or oblique crossings.
Yeah.
And that's it. And every single other piece of complex track work which requires an interlocking can be constructed from those three basic components. And one of the reasons why I want to run these webinars is because I want to explain that. When I talk about, junctions, like what's a railway junction? How do we build it up? What do we have to control? I found it so much easier to explain to someone who doesn't have a background in interlocking let's have a look at a turnout. How do we signal a turnout? That's it, just a turnout. Then have a look at an oblique crossing. How does one signal an oblique crossing? And then you can move on to more interesting things. Like generally I'll go to a double line junction or perhaps scissor crossover. Normally I stay away from double slips just because everything's so crowded. So scissor crossover, a double line junction, and you say, here's the diamond, here are the turnouts, so therefore we'll need these signals. Now these signals are co-located, so let's combine them into one signal, and then you can talk about things like routes. And then you can say, right, this turnout has these 3 routes, or this turnout has these 4 routes associated with it, and a diamond crossing also has 4 routes associated with it. The layout of the junction itself, how the plain track connects the turnouts and the diamond crossings, limits the amount of overall routes that we have in a junction from, the space of permutations for possible routes is limited by the layout of the junction. You can tell that I really love mathematics as well. I tend to get quite mathematical because when I program, I have the privilege of learning C first, which means that you have to consider the mathematics of the algorithm and stuff like complexity, order number, or operations. So I come at this kind of stuff designed from a mathematical perspective. And then with interlocking, it's like, right, eliminate all the other possibilities, all the routes that can't exist. You're left with what you do. You signal the boundary of the junction, and then plan your route from there. And I found it a very useful way to introduce people to interlocking. Not necessarily from what do signaling engineers have to design? You design that, then you design that, then you design that. Then it's more like, what is the ultimate purpose of this junction? And then at every stage you think about, right, you design this and it's as simple as possible to meet the purpose that we just established. However, there's a problem. It's like train operated route release. The reason why we have train operated route release is because when we move from, mechanical signal, when we move from signal box operation at junctions to, train control sensor operation at junctions, no longer was there, obvious indications such as lever frames of whether a route was still set or not. So there had to be a route release mechanism. And one of the most convenient ways of doing that is train operator route release. And it's like, but if you don't kind of explain where Tor came from, it's quite difficult unless you've been working with the system or you actually were a train controller or signaler to really understand it.
Yeah.
So I love looking at signaling as a chronological development of systems, because it is a chronology. It's a wonderful chronology, and it's also very mathematical, very programmatical, and you build up. And I love thinking about things from a constructivist perspective. Like, what are our building blocks, our base building blocks? By the way, can you guess what my favorite toy was when I was a kid? I think most viewers probably could.
It must have been something pretty complicated, yeah, like a self-built robot or something like that, or
no, not at all. It was literally the wooden blocks that you get a kid so they can build little railways.
Yeah.
You put it down, and I do remember spending like hours like just looking at the geometry, because these blocks, they're carved in wood and they've got the two tracks. But I was always just looking at the junction blocks, going, how does the axle of my little train set take both routes? And I only had to apply little bits of pressure to it to get to go one way or the other.
Yeah.
Episode 4 has been the most viewed in the history of this podcast by a big margin, certainly due to the seniority of the guest as managing director of one of the most fascinating and innovative railway organizations in the world, and also due to his popularity in his home country, India. The following clips are just two of many highlights of this conversation with Vinay Kumar Singh. The first one gives tips and tools how to keep a complex project on track. And the second one is a truly legendary answer about keys for success of a project organization.
We have a very strong strategy of risk mitigation. We identify the risks and we keep on working on those risks till they are eliminated. We keep a very exhaustive list of expected risks, what can go wrong with the project. We work on plan B. We always keep a plan B. And there is a very close monitoring of the contracts, means at all levels, starting from the bottom of the pyramid till my level. Is out of all the packages, I am personally able to monitor them at a frequency of a fortnight, each and every package. So that helps a lot, and I'll share with you that we have gone for some technological inputs also in the interventions, like common data environment. We work on a common data environment, and the project is fully on the BIM. So we are bottom up, we are in the BIM environment. All designs, collaborations, everything is done on common data environment and BIM platform. We are going for asset management system, very comprehensive asset management system. And to assist this asset management system, we have track monitoring system, and we have predictive maintenance module for the rolling stock. So a lot of technology we have introduced, not only in the system, but in project implementation also. That is helping us in keeping the project on track.
If you would want to give, say, 1, 2, or 3, I leave it to you, tips how a project like this has the best chances to succeed, what would you say? What would you recommend to other railways in the world who want to do something similar to what you're doing? What are the main things to look after to make sure that the project has the best chances for success?
So with the caveat that each project, each country has its own constraints and own local conditions, circumstances.
Yes.
As far as I am concerned, if I talk from my perspective and general understanding of the projects happening across the world, the 3-4 things which are very important. Number one is that project should be conceptualized with very clear vision. What we intend to do, what is our objective, why we are doing it. That should be the number one thing. We should be very clear. Number two, as far as implementation is concerned, we should know what are the potential hazards or the potential risk. Those risks should be identified, starting from financial risk to political risk to project implementation risk, such as I was discussing with you, the tree cutting permissions or some sensitive zone. All those should be identified initially, and we should try to avoid them. Otherwise, later on, this can create a lot of problem for projects. Then, as we have clarity about the project, we should have clarity about the design and the technologies to be used, and our contracting, the procurement methodology should be so aligned that we are able to achieve what we have thought out at the initial stage. And then the most important thing is there should be a leadership team which has very clear vision, very clear ideas, and they should have courage to take decisions. With a team which can implement the vision of this leadership team, that is also very, very important, because we can envision everything. If it is not implemented, it has no value. But if there is a team which can implement those ideas, those visions, then that is the best combination which can make the project implementation much more simpler than what otherwise projects face.
This is a beautiful answer, and just for the listeners, this is all off the cuff. I did not tell Vinay any of the questions beforehand. We are basically just improvising here, and I really love that answer. It's sticking to the vision as the number one. So many projects I see with really, really good planning, with really good intentions, and then they go into delivery and then they let it slip, they let it go, they forget about the main priorities, or some other things come in the way. The second thing, risk management. Everybody says, project management is risk management, but very few projects really mean it and really implement it very, very consequentially. And then the third one is, and I suspected something like this, is really the coherent management team, that everybody in the management team is aligned with the vision and really pulls in the same direction. This is so important compared to an environment where all the managers are trying to build their own little kingdoms and pulling in different directions and so on. And I think as a leader, you must have done a fantastic job over there to basically align all your managers, and the success of your program basically confirms that you're doing a good job.
Episode 5 presented a partly quite controversial discussion with all-time CBTC great Alan Rumsey, who played devil's advocate regarding CBTC interoperability. In the first of the two coming clips, Alan and Doc Frank discuss the potential need for CBTC interoperability, and the second clip discusses whether interoperable CBTC standards like the recent ones from China would be usable for the specific requirements of non-Chinese metro operators.
So what is it now that is driving the need for interoperability? Since, all our experience, the ETCS experience, New York experience, that it's not a trivial activity. Actually producing an interoperable CBTC system available from multiple suppliers is very complicated, very time consuming. So what is the business case that's driving it?
Okay, and I've got a response to that, and I'm using New York as a beautiful example for that. So you do have some metro networks that basically consist of standalone lines, either because there's only one line end-to-end anyway, or if we have multiple lines, they are separated from each other, so you can do on each line pretty much whatever you want. So Singapore is a good example. You've got lines, for example, the northeast line, which is completely separated from the northeast line. Yes, north-south and northeast are two lines which are completely separate. I'll take north-south and circle, for example. Yeah, so what you can do and what they have done is to use one CBTC supplier on the one line end to end. So the entire line is fitted wayside with CBTC of that one supplier. And all the trains, every train on that line operating is fitted with CBTC onboard from the same supplier. So to me, this is not interoperability. For me, this is just one supplier delivering their solution and it works. And on the other line, there's a different CBTC supplier, both for wayside and for onboard on every train operating on the other line. And interoperability between those two lines is not required because the two lines are not connected. There's no train from the one line that will ever have to go onto the other line. So what I define as interoperability in this case is not required. Now, if you compare that with a network like New York, for example, where you've got many different lines coming together and then sharing a central piece of corridor, a trunk line, if you will, this will make it very, very hard to follow the same model, to have a single CBTC supplier for everything. Because if you have a CBTC supplier for the central trunk section, that same supplier would also have to fit all the lines that are coming out of this trunk section. So in New York, basically, you have this differentiation between Division A and Division B. So it would basically mean that your entire Division A network would have to be fitted by one supplier and the entire Division B network by a different supplier, maybe the same, maybe a different. And this is something that New York didn't want. They said, well, look, our Division A is huge. That's a network in itself. We cannot rely for the entire network for a single supplier. We have to have multiple suppliers. But then we have the problem of interoperability that these two different products of those two suppliers, they don't talk to each other. They are not interoperable. So for New York, we need to come up with a solution for interoperability. You know that you were involved in the planning process, and you also know how long it took New York, how expensive it was for them to get to interoperability, and how painful it was. It took them 25 years to get there. And I've just done a paper. Now I'm doing a paper in summer, probably on a conference here in Australia. I've done a video on New York based on your paper and some later updates. So the interoperability journey of New York was extremely painful. Now, if I advise a client here in Australia, for example, so if a network like Melbourne wants to introduce CBTC and they have a network of lines that are interconnected, so basically like New York, not quite the same, but they also have interconnected lines, which means that they either have to go for a model where they have a single supplier for the entire network, but then they say, wait a minute, our network is too big. We can't afford this. We need to have multiple suppliers. And then you immediately have this interoperability problem and you say, well, we don't have interoperable products of CBTC. What do we do? And then you need to start thinking about cutting apart the lines, like segregating the lines, which is a huge impact if the operation was based on trains changing between lines and so on. So, and Melbourne is currently failing because of that. Yeah, so they find it is just too difficult to make this line segregation. And as a consequence, guess what? They're moving away from CBTC. They're now looking at ETCS because they say we need to have an interoperable solution, and CBTC in its current state is not it.
The Chinese initiative is certainly very interesting, and they've certainly done a lot of effort in developing standards and interoperable interfaces. As far as I know, these standards are not available in English yet, so it's a little difficult. And I don't know to what extent they've been fully validated and safety certified and so on with multiple suppliers. But again, the underlying worry there is, in my 40 years of implementing CBTC around the world, I don't know two agencies that have had the same specification. Every agency has their unique set of requirements. Every CBTC product requires somewhere between 20% and 80% of the software to be reworked to meet the agency-specific requirement. So a standard that's been developed for the Chinese metro market, is that going to be acceptable to a global market? I don't know. ETCS have the advantage that it's mandated by law. So if you want to put in ETCS, you have to put in this version of ETCS. So it's a little difficult there. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic because one can see conceptually, academically, if you like, all the benefits of an interoperable multiple supplier solution. But again, to actually get there, there has to be a process that could get us there, and that process is only going to work if there's a business case not only for the agencies but for the suppliers.
Yes.
And that's the challenge.
Yes. Yes, and that's one of the most interesting factors when I did my research on interoperability, which is leading to that paper that is coming out in February in the RSE News, where I looked at different interoperability initiatives, and ETCS was one of them. And then what New York did with CBTC. Then I looked at the Paris approach. I looked at the IEEE standards, the established standards, which today are not providing interoperability. And then I compared them and I thought about why are some of these approaches successful? Why do they lead to interoperability and others don't? And I found a common set of drivers that can either help an approach getting towards interoperability or preventing it from getting to interoperability. And the point that you said, is there a business case, is in fact very, very relevant, because you need a business case from the agency perspective. So I call this market pull. For ETCS, it's a legal mandate in Europe that ETCS has to be used. So that's the market pull. A supplier that wants to do automatic train protection in Europe has to have ETCS and has to have ETCS according to the standards. So for them, it's a requirement to participate in the marketplace. So that's a market pull. If they don't want to do ETCS, they can't play in that European market. And therefore they do play because the market is attractive enough. New York, similar story. New York said, well, look, we've got this huge network. Which supplier would be interested in developing an interoperable CBTC solution? And the carrot for that is that they are allowed to participate in the New York CBTC market. And there were at least 3 suppliers who said, this looks attractive enough for us to go through the pain and effort and cost to develop an interoperable solution so that we can participate in the New York market. And the same is in China. In China, there is this China Association of Metros, and they said, we are developing these interoperable standards. Anybody who wants to do CBTC in China on a Chinese metro, and there are heaps of them, needs to comply with those standards. And guess what? Everybody complied. And it didn't matter whether they had existing products that didn't comply and they had to change the products, which is a big obstacle at the moment for all these Western suppliers. So if, for example, the IEEE standards were expanded towards interoperability, that would mean that some of the existing CBTC products would no longer be compliant with those new standards. So suppliers would have to go back and change their products, or create a second version of the product that complies with the new interoperable standards. And that's a financial effort that most suppliers are not willing, to date, are not willing to go for. Where you say, is there a business case for the suppliers? And the answer in most cases so far has been, no, there isn't. Yeah, that's why suppliers don't go for it. But it may change in the future.
Episode 6 with London-based consultant Andy Harrison brought a much more agreeing discussion which highlighted several important aspects of the state of the signaling industry as new digital technologies such as CBTC or ETCS are being introduced. What follows are 5 short clips that provide some of those discussion points, ending with an optimistic outlook regarding generational change.
You said something that the signaling industry has changed quite a bit, which is, by the way, something that I noted as well. What do you mean by that? How do you see the recent changes that we are seeing in the industry?
I think it's in all the years that we've been working in railway signaling, and personally, that's almost 40 now. I was expecting to see over that period of time the application of the LTMS, ETCS, CBTC systems to become much more widespread and to become almost the de facto standards for new signaling schemes across the world. For costs to have reduced, or life cycle support costs to have reduced. And I think in my recent work with clients, I'm not really seeing that. I'm seeing the costs of signaling installations continue to rise, both in the UK and in other places. And I'm seeing a real nervousness within railway authorities about taking on life cycle support costs for these high technology systems, which have very different maintenance requirements, very different obsolescence management requirements than have existed previously with the technology that we've previously been using. And so I think the worry I have is that we're working very hard to create some extremely interesting technology to support improved signaling, but perhaps we're not doing it in a way which is very cost effective, very deliverable, and very maintainable over the life cycle of those systems. And as a result, actually, railway authorities and more importantly passengers, the freight companies, are not getting the benefits that the improved signaling systems can provide. And I worry, I think, that I don't see a tipping point where that cost increase changes to become a cost decrease.
With a system like CBTC, where the single point of responsibility for design changes, for obsolescence management, for all these things sits with the supplier, the client needs to have a long-term, almost like a partnering relationship with the supplier. So basically as some kind of technology partner. But that's an approach that was never used, that was never needed in conventional signaling. And this is a mind shift that client organizations have to do, which seems pretty obvious for you or me, because we have the perspective of many other projects elsewhere. But even if we try our best to convince client organizations as consultants that this is how it needs to be, they listen, but they can't get their head around it. That's my impression anyway.
It's a really valid point, I think, you made. The whole issue of partnership is becoming, I think, much more obvious in the industry now. I think people are starting to wake up that instead of having a short-term particular delivery contract for a particular scheme or a particular route, what's required now is a long-term relationship between the railway authority and the supply company, both for the delivery but also for the management of that system through its life. And that's a fundamental shift. Railway authorities used to, and still do for many technologies, which hold maintenance responsibility, first-line maintenance responsibility, particularly. For a lot of these modern technologies, that's simply not appropriate anymore. So the railway authority is changing the fundamental nature of the way it maintains the railway, because it's actually contracting out to the supplier of the system over perhaps 15, 20, 25 or 30 years. And more than simply first-line maintenance and making sure that the system is performing and is available as required.
Yeah.
These to do with supply chain issues and the component changes, component unavailability over the life cycle of the system, and obsolescence, simply obsolescence management.
Yeah.
In 10 or 15 years, the base components of a lot of the systems that we're dealing with now will be no longer available.
Yes.
And that obsolescence management approach needs to be fundamentally different. So I think you're right. It's kind of my summary of that. The change from a contract-driven environment to a partnership-driven environment is clearly the way forward for a lot of these technologies. we have a railway authority that needs to maintain a railway which has been around for a long time, using its more traditional mind, and it's trying to change to maintain to deliver and maintain a railway using these new technologies, which requires a fundamentally different way of working. So you have these two things running together in parallel, and that's why I think there's a lot of talk in our world about change management. But it's really it's how to manage two parallel ways of working, because the existing railways have been exist for a long time.
Yeah.
Many years.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a long time to transition to a railway based on new technology. So we're going to be faced with having these two operating paradigms running together for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge.
Oh, it is. It is. And many people hear change management and they think, we just have to change the job description. Yeah. So you get a new piece of paper which outlines a couple of your functions, of your job functions have changed, and that's about that. But it does really require a quite substantial change of mindset, of fundamental mindset that had been molded for decades and decades.
The existing working practices are going to change, and they're going to be driven not just by managers feeling that they want to do things in a different way. They're going to be driven by the fact that their technology requires things to be done in a different way. And that's particularly the case for the sorts of systems that we're dealing with DCS, with CBTC, with TMS and other things. And it gets even more complicated when you start thinking about the role of the supplier, the technology supplier, against the role of the railway authority, where competence in the system, the knowledge of how these systems work and operate, invested in the supply organisation rather than invested in the railway authority. So the railway authority requirements for competence are fundamentally different in the brave new world than they are at the moment. And that requires a shift in thinking and a shift in process, as you say, whilst still maintaining enough of the knowledge and competence of the existing railway to make sure that that continues to work during this very long transition period when new technology starts arriving. So I think it's a hugely challenging time to be a railway authority, to be part of a railway authority. And what I'm seeing in the work that I do is that as younger people join railway organisations and start to progress their careers and they become more professional in what they're doing, and eventually they become more senior in an organisation, their expectations are different to the people that were in charge when I started working. Their expectations of technology, their expectations of change, their expectations of the pace of change are fundamentally different. And I think the hope, if you like, at the end of this conversation, the hope is that those young people will continue to develop in a way which actually supports a better use of technology, a more rounded set of competences for more people to enjoy better careers, all for the benefit of passengers and for freight customers, and at a price which, in most countries, the taxpayer can actually afford. And so I think I'm relying on that generational change and generational involvement to start to really get behind the changes that we're talking about here.
That's a very nice, optimistic statement to wrap this up. I've had some of these interviews with younger chaps who've been in the rail industry and the signaling industry somewhere between 6 months and 6 years. And I was quite impressed by the level of perspective that those guys have. And I am carefully optimistic that things may actually develop in the way that you just described, which would be hugely beneficial for the entire industry. Hi, this is Doc Frank. Let me jump in here right now to tell you about a new training which is called High Capacity Signaling Blueprint. This is a very unique all-in-one training that gives you everything you need to know about high capacity signaling. The foundations, where you can compare what conventional signaling is to what high capacity signaling is with all the necessary definitions. Then we look at CBTC, communications-based train control, as the prime technology for high capacity signaling and how this is done. In the third part of the training, we look at varieties of the European Train Control System, ETCS, another global train control technology and how this can be used to achieve high capacity signaling. And then at the end of the training comes an actual blueprint how to apply CBTC or ETCS to get a real high capacity outcome for your railway. It's basically 3 training courses in one, and as usual for my trainings, there is a study group available for joint learning with other people taking the same training. And after the training, you will get into an alumni community, which is exclusive for my training students, where you can ask questions and get them answered by myself on an ongoing basis for a guaranteed minimum of 12 months. You can sign up on my usual training platform, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/HCS blueprint. I said it again, docfranktraining.podia.com/HCS blueprint, with HCS being the acronym for High Capacity Signaling. If it's important for you to learn about the latest trend in railway signaling, which is high capacity signaling, then this is the training for you. Hi, it's Dr. Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry. And I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.